The moment Caroline Bishop heard the words come out of Martha Greer's mouth, the world tilted sideways beneath her boots. "You know he does that for everyone, don't you, sweetheart?" Martha said, her voice carrying that particular sweetness that women in Dusthaven, Texas learned to use like a blade in 1883. She was leaning against the dry goods counter, her fingers trailing over a bolt of calico fabric, her smile slow and deliberate. "Seth Reed is just a naturally kind man. Saves every stray that wanders into this town. You shouldn't read anything personal into it." Caroline stood very still. The general store smelled of tobacco and dried herbs and sawdust, and outside on the main street of Dusthaven, horses were tied to posts in the afternoon heat. She had a paper-wrapped parcel in her hands, flour and salt and a tin of molasses, and she was gripping it hard enough that the brown paper was crackling under her fingers. "I didn't say I read anything into it," Caroline said quietly. "No, but you were thinking it." Martha's smile widened. "Every woman new to town thinks the same thing when Seth takes a shine to helping her. He helped me when my wagon lost a wheel 2 years ago. He helped Della Forsyth when her roof was leaking. He helped the widow Crane when she needed firewood through the whole of January." Martha tilted her head. "That's just who he is. Don't go building castles in the air." Caroline walked out of the store without another word. She stood on the boardwalk in the copper-colored light of late afternoon, the heat pressing down on her like a hand, and she breathed carefully through her nose. Her heart was doing something strange and painful. She had been in Dusthaven for 3 months. She had arrived with nothing but a carpet bag, a worn-out pair of boots, and a dark past she was not prepared to explain to anyone. And from the very first day, Seth Reed had been there. That was the problem, wasn't it? She had told herself it meant nothing. She had told herself the same story Martha Greer had just told her, that Seth was simply a good man, a generous man, a man who extended courtesy and assistance to everyone who needed it. She had repeated that story every single morning when she woke up in the tiny room above the Dusthaven laundry where she worked 6 days a week. She had repeated it every time she saw him, every time he handed her something she hadn't asked for, every time he looked at her with those quiet gray eyes that seemed to see all the way through the careful walls she had built around herself. She had believed the story. Right up until this moment, she had believed it so thoroughly that she had not let herself feel a single dangerous feeling. And now Martha Greer had said it out loud, confirmed it with generous satisfaction, and instead of making Caroline feel better, it had done something completely unexpected. It had broken something open in her chest. Because she realized, standing on that boardwalk with the parcel of flour and salt in her arms, that somewhere in the past 3 months she had stopped believing the story. Somewhere along the way, without giving herself permission, she had started to believe something else entirely. And now she had to figure out whether she was a fool. She had come to Dusthaven in the spring of 1883, in the middle of a dust storm that turned the sky the color of a bruise and drove everyone indoors. The stagecoach from Abilene had deposited her and her single carpet bag on the main street with no ceremony and no welcome, and the driver had not waited to see if she was all right before turning the horses around and heading back north. Caroline had stood in the street with grit in her teeth and her eyes streaming, and she had been absolutely, catastrophically alone. She was 24 years old. She had $43 sewn into the hem of her skirt. She had left behind a life in Abilene that had been slowly crushing her into something unrecognizable, and she did not have a plan beyond getting far enough away that the crushing could stop. Her husband, Garland Bishop, had died in February. She was not precisely mourning him. That was the darkest part of her secret, the part she had never spoken aloud, the truth she carried like a stone at the bottom of a river. The knowledge that when the doctor came to the house and told her that Garland Bishop had suffered a fatal heart episode in the back room of the Silver Dollar Saloon, she had felt, beneath the required grief and the required black dress and the required pale face, an enormous and terrifying relief. Garland Bishop had been a man of considerable charm on the outside and considerable cruelty on the inside, and their 5 years of marriage had been an education in the difference between those two things. He had never struck her with a fist. He had not needed to. He was skilled in the arts of diminishment and isolation, and the particular kind of coldness that does not leave visible marks. And by the time he died, Caroline had been so thoroughly hollowed out that she barely recognized her own reflection. She had buried him, settled his debts, discovered he had also left behind a secondary set of debts she had not known about, paid those too from what little remained of her own small inheritance from her mother, and then she had packed a bag and gotten on a stagecoach heading south. Dusthaven had been an accident. She had simply run out of money for the fare at this particular stop. The dust storm was still blowing when Seth Reed found her. She had been standing on the boardwalk outside the closed general store, pressing herself back against the wall and covering her face with her arm, when a hand had appeared at her elbow, steady and unhurried, and a voice had said, over the roar of the wind, "You're going to want to get inside. Come on." She had let herself be guided, which was not something she did. She had learned very thoroughly not to let herself be guided by the hand of any man, because hands that seemed to guide could grip without warning. But something in that voice, steady, matter-of-fact, carrying no undertone of anything she should fear, had bypassed her careful defenses before she could stop it. He had brought her to the livery stable, which was warm and smelled of horses and hay, and was blessedly out of the wind. There were 4 other people already sheltering their old Cyrus who ran the livery, a Mexican family with 2 small children who had been on the road, and a young cowhand named Pete who was half asleep against a hay bale. Seth Reed had given her his coat. She had looked at it, looked at him, and said, "I'm fine." He had said, "You're shaking," and placed it around her shoulders with the same calm efficiency with which a person sets a fence post, and then he had turned away and started helping Cyrus shore up the livery door against the wind. She had sat there in a horse blanket smell and a too large coat and watched Seth Reed work, and she had thought, "He doesn't know me from Adam. He doesn't know my name or where I'm from or what I've done or what I've lost or who I was before, and he just gave me his coat." It had been, she would think later, one of the most disorienting moments of her adult life. He was 30 years old, she would learn. He was lean and sun-darkened, with sandy brown hair that needed cutting and hands that were marked with old scars and new calluses, the hands of a man who worked hard and did not complain about it. He had a ranch about 4 miles outside of Dusthaven, a modest operation of 200 acres where he ran cattle and kept horses and lived alone in a house he had built himself. He was not wealthy, but he was not struggling either. He was careful and competent and self-contained. He was not a man who talked much, but he had given her his coat. The storm had broken by evening. By then, Caroline had been installed in the small room above the laundry thanks to Mrs. Ida Prout, the laundry's owner, who had taken one look at Caroline's face and her single carpet bag and said, "You need work in a room or just a room?" Caroline had said work in a room, and Mrs. Prout had said, "Good. Rates are $2 a week and you start tomorrow." Seth Reed had carried her carpet bag up the stairs without being asked. She had said, "You don't need to do that." He had set it down inside the door and said, "No," and left. She had stood in the middle of that small plain room, a cot, a washstand, a window looking out over the back alley, and held herself very still for a long time. Then she had taken a breath, unpacked her bag with methodical care, and told herself that this was just how things were done in small towns. People helped strangers. It meant nothing personal. For 3 months she maintained that story with tremendous discipline. Seth Reed came into town twice a week, sometimes 3 times. He had business at the feed store and the blacksmith and occasionally the bank. He was not a man who spent much time at the saloon. She would see him on the main street, and he would nod at her, not the quick dismissive nod that men gave to women they considered unremarkable, but a slow, deliberate nod that acknowledged her specifically, the way a person acknowledges someone they have been thinking about. She told herself she was imagining the specificity. In April, Her roof had sprung a leak directly above her cot during a spring rain. She had moved the cot and placed a bucket under the drip and told herself she would speak to Mrs. Pruitt about it in the morning. In the morning, before she had said a word to anyone, Seth had arrived with shingles and nails and fixed it. She had watched from the window of the laundry below as he climbed down the ladder, wondering how he had known. Mrs. Pruitt, when asked, had said she hadn't mentioned it to anyone. In May, there had been an incident. A man named Dale Rucker, who ran cattle for one of the larger ranches north of town, had taken it upon himself to be familiar with Caroline in a way she had not invited. He had a habit of coming by the laundry on days when Mrs. Pruitt was out and leaning against the counter and talking at her with his thumbs in his belt and his eyes tracking her in a way that made the back of her neck prickle with cold recognition. The same prickling she had learned to recognize during 5 years of marriage to Garland Bishop. She had been managing it. She knew how to manage it. She had learned in her marriage the careful and exhausting art of deflection and rerouting, and making herself as flat and uninteresting as possible so that the attention would move on. She had not told anyone about it, because telling people things was something she had learned not to do. But one afternoon in May, Seth had been in the laundry picking up a bundle of freshly laundered shirts, and Dale Rucker had come in, and the entire character of the room had changed in the span of 5 seconds. Seth had gone very still and very quiet in the way that some men go still and quiet when they are deciding something. He had not said anything threatening. He had not raised his voice. He had simply turned to look at Dale Rucker with those gray eyes, steady and measuring, and he had said in a perfectly conversational tone, "I don't think I've seen you around here when Ida Pruitt is in the room. That interesting to you?" Dale Rucker had said nothing for a long moment. Then he had picked up his laundry and left. He had not come back. Seth had finished paying for his shirts, tipped his hat to Caroline with that slow, deliberate nod, and walked out as if nothing had happened. Caroline had stood behind the counter for a full minute afterward, breathing carefully. She had told herself, he would have done that for anyone. He would have done that for Mrs. Pruitt. He would have done that for the Mexican family's wife who sometimes brought laundry in. He would have done it because it was the right thing, not because it was for her specifically. She had believed that with her whole practical heart. In June, her $43 were running thin. She had needed new boots because the old ones had given out completely, and she had needed to pay for medication when a summer fever had laid her low for 10 days and kept her from working. Mrs. Pruitt had been understanding about the work, but the room rate had still needed paying. When Caroline had gone, with considerable difficulty, to explain to Mrs. Pruitt that she needed 2 more weeks before she could settle what she owed, she had discovered that her debt had already been paid. Mrs. Pruitt had said, with the particular careful tone of a woman who has been told to say nothing, "It's taken care of, dear." Caroline had stood in the kitchen of the laundry and thought very hard about who in Dusthaven would have known she was behind on her room rate. She had thought about it, and she had arrived at a name, and then she had immediately quarantined that thought in a place where she could not look at it directly, because looking at it directly meant feeling things she was not ready to feel. She had told herself, he must have heard from Mrs. Pruitt. He must have done it because Mrs. Pruitt is the kind of woman who takes in strays, and Seth Reed is the kind of man who would want to help someone like Mrs. Pruitt solve a problem. It was a chain of kindness that had simply landed near Caroline, not on her. She should not read anything personal into it. And then Martha Greer had confirmed it all with her sweet sideways smile, and something had broken open anyway. Caroline walked home from the general store in the late afternoon heat, the parcel in her arms, her boots raising little clouds of red dust on the unpaved street. She nodded to people she passed. She smiled at the sheriff's wife, who was watering the pots of geraniums on her porch. She stopped to let a dog cross her path. She did all the ordinary, automatic things a person does, and inside her chest, something was doing something complicated and unwelcome. She was afraid she was in love with Seth Reed. She was afraid she had been for a while, and had simply been calling it by another name. She was afraid that the story Martha Greer had told, that Seth's kindness was habit and reflex and general goodwill toward all stranded and struggling women in his vicinity, was exactly true, and that she had let herself, in the carefully shielded and never quite examined part of herself, believe otherwise. She set the parcel on her small table and sat down on her cot and looked at the patched ceiling for a long time. She had been very good, since Garland, at not wanting things. Wanting things had proven expensive in ways that had nothing to do with money. She had learned to keep her wants small and achievable and safely within her own reach: a warm room, enough food, a job that was hard but honest. She had not let herself want anything that depended on another person, because other people were unpredictable and could take things away. She had not, she was absolutely certain, planned to want Seth Reed. But there it was. And tomorrow she would wake up and go back to the laundry, and the next time he came into town, she would nod politely and keep her face arranged in its usual pleasant, unrevealing expression, because she was a practical woman, and she understood that her feelings were her own business and nobody else's, and certainly not the business of a man who gave his coat to every stranded woman in a dust storm, and paid off the room rates of people he had no particular attachment to. She went to sleep telling herself this very firmly. She woke up in the gray pre-dawn light to the sound of someone on her exterior staircase. She was on her feet before she was fully awake, because 5 years of marriage to Garland Bishop had trained her nervous system for sudden noises in ways she was still unlearning. She had her hand on the windowsill and was looking out before the second footfall, and in the thin gray light she could make out a figure on the landing below her window. Seth Reed. He had a bundle of something under his arm. He was standing at the base of her stairs looking up, and when he saw her at the window he stopped moving. They looked at each other through the gray morning air for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Then he said, quietly, so as not to wake the whole alley, "I wasn't going to knock. I was going to leave this." She opened the window further. "Leave what?" He held up the bundle. She could see now that it was a warm shawl, a good heavy wool one, the kind that cost real money at the dry goods store. "The weather's turning," he said. "Nights are going to get cold. I know you've been making do with your jacket." She stared at him. He stared back. She was aware that she was in her nightgown and her hair was loose, and this was an extremely irregular situation, and none of that felt as significant as the thing that was happening in the middle of her chest. "Seth," she said. "Yes. Did you pay Mrs. Prout my room rate in June?" The silence was perhaps 4 seconds long, which was answer enough. "Yes," he said. "Why?" she said. He shifted the shawl under his arm. He looked down at the alley for a moment, then back up at her, and in the growing light she could see his face clearly, that quiet, self-contained face that gave so little away and yet right now was giving away something, something careful and still and significant. "Because you needed it paid," he said, "and I could pay it." "That's not a reason," she said. "That's a description." He was quiet for a moment. "I know. Martha Greer told me yesterday that you help everyone," Caroline said, "that it's just your nature. That I shouldn't read anything personal into it." Something moved across his face. It was brief, but she caught it, a flicker of something that might have been pain or frustration or something that had been patient for a long time and was growing less patient. "Martha Greer doesn't know what she's talking about," he said quietly. Caroline's heart did something so forceful that she pressed her hand briefly to her sternum as if she could hold it steady. "Meaning what?" she said. He looked up at her for a long moment. The light was growing, turning from gray to the pale gold of early morning, and the town was beginning to stir around them. Somewhere down the street a rooster was declaring itself, and from the livery came the sound of horses being fed. "Meaning I don't do this for everyone," he said. "I don't do any of this for everyone. I thought you knew that. I thought that was—" He stopped, tried again. "I thought I was being clear." "You were being kind," she said. "People are kind for all sorts of reasons." "Not me," he said. I'm not a particularly kind man, Caroline. I'm a straightforward one. I'm kind to people I'm kind to, and I'm indifferent to the rest, and I've never in my life gotten up before dawn to leave a shawl outside someone's window." He paused. In case that distinction matters. She was gripping the windowsill. It matters, she whispered. He nodded slowly, as if she had confirmed something he had been waiting a long time to have confirmed. All right, he said. Then maybe you'd let me buy you supper at the hotel dining room on Saturday evening. She looked at him for a long time. The fear was there, the old fear, the trained fear, the fear that had her body's full attention and was sending her all its familiar signals. She knew what it was like to accept kindness from a man. She knew what the cost of that could be. But she also knew, in the most honest and undeceivable part of herself, that Seth Reed was not Garland Bishop. She had been watching him for 3 months with the careful, involuntary attention of a woman who has been hurt and cannot stop herself from cataloging everything that might indicate further hurt, and she had cataloged nothing alarming. What she had cataloged was a man who was direct and patient and honest, who kept his word, who treated the people around him with a quiet, steady respect, who had never once made her feel smaller or trapped or watched in a way that made her cold, who had, in fact, from the very first moment made her feel the opposite of those things, and she had been so determined not to trust it that she had called it something else. Saturday, she said. Yes. His expression did not change dramatically. It was not the face of a man who showed his feelings in large, obvious ways, but something in it settled the way a shoulder settles when a burden has been put down. Good, he said. He held up the shawl. I'll leave this on the rail. He set it on the landing rail and went back down the stairs, and she listened to his footsteps cross the alley and recede. And then she stood at the window in her nightgown with the dawn coming up gold and enormous over the Dusthaven rooftops, and she pressed both hands over her heart and stood there for a long time. She was terrified. She was also, for the first time in a very long time, something that felt dangerously close to hopeful. Saturday came with blue skies and a dry wind that carried the smell of sage and cattle from the surrounding plains. Caroline pressed her one good dress, a dark blue wool chally that she had bought second-hand and altered to fit herself properly, and pinned her hair up in the style she had given up bothering with since coming to Dusthaven. And when she looked at herself in the small mirror over the washstand, she saw someone who looked, for the first time in perhaps years, like a woman who was allowing herself something. She met Seth at the hotel at 6 o'clock. He was there before her, standing on the hotel porch in a clean dark coat and a pressed shirt, his hat in his hands, and when he saw her coming down the street, he did something she had never seen him do before. He smiled. Not the polite half-acknowledgement that passed for smiling in most of the men she knew, but a real smile, slow, deliberate, full-faced, and it changed his whole expression so thoroughly that she almost stopped walking. "You look beautiful," he said, and the word beautiful sounded in his plain-spoken way like a fact rather than a pleasantry. "Thank you," she said. "You look considerably less dusty than usual." He laughed, also a revelation, because she had rarely heard him laugh, and it was a good sound, low and genuine. "That's the best I can do," he said. The hotel dining room was the nicest establishment in Dusthaven, which was not saying a great deal. It had 6 tables covered in oilcloth, a handwritten menu on a chalkboard, and a stove in the corner that made the room warm. But the food was good roasted chicken and potatoes and fresh bread, and the couple who ran it, Frank and Nora DeLacy, were friendly without being intrusive, and the other 4 occupied tables were strangers passing through who had no interest in Seth and Caroline. They ate slowly and talked in the careful way of 2 people who are accustomed to saying very little and are finding, with some surprise, that they want to say quite a lot. She told him she was from Illinois originally, that she had come to Kansas with her family at 17, that she had been married and widowed. She did not tell him the details of the marriage. She was not ready for that. He told her he was from Missouri, that he had come to Texas at 22 following a cattle drive that had ended here rather than elsewhere, that he had liked the land and stayed. He told her about building the house, about the first 2 years when nothing had gone right and the cattle had been thin and the well had run dry, about the 3rd year when things had turned and he had understood that he was going to be all right. "You built the house yourself," she said. "Mostly," he said. "Cyrus helped with the roof framing, and old Jefferson Crow, you might have seen him at the blacksmith's, he helped with the chimney, but the rest, yes." "That's a large undertaking," she said. "It was," he said. "I had a lot of evenings to fill." She looked at him across the oilcloth table. "You live very alone," she said, not accusingly, just noting it. "I have," he agreed. He looked at her steadily. "It's my own preference, mostly." She understood what mostly meant. After supper they walked in the cooling evening air, down the main street and around the side streets, not quite touching, the sky overhead going deep blue and then purple and filling up with stars. She was aware of his presence beside her the way she was aware of warmth, something that the body turns toward without being instructed. He walked her back to her staircase. At the bottom of the stairs he stopped and she stopped, and they looked at each other in the dark for a moment. "I want to tell you something," he said. "All right." "I know you came here with something behind you," he said carefully. "I don't know what it is and I'm not asking you to tell me, but I want you to know that I see it. I see that you're careful in ways that a person learns to be careful when something has cost them a great deal." He paused. "I'm not in a hurry. I just wanted to say that." Caroline looked at the ground for a moment, then up at him. "My husband wasn't good to me," she said. It was the first time she had ever said it in those words to anyone. Her voice was steady. He nodded once. "He's gone now," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm glad he's gone." She blinked. "That's a frank thing to say," she said. "I'm a frank man," he said. She laughed, a short, startled sound that surprised her. "Yes," she said, "you are." He walked back toward the livery where his horse was stabled, and she climbed the stairs to her small room, and she sat on the cot in the dark and listened to the town settle into nighttime sounds around her. And she thought about what it meant that a man she had known for 3 months had just correctly identified the entire shape of her hidden life in a few careful sentences, without pressing, without prying, without using it for anything. She thought it might mean that he was, in fact, paying an unusual amount of attention. The next 3 weeks were a different kind of existence than any she had known in years. Seth came to town 3 times a week as he always had, but now, when he was there, he made a point of finding her, not intrusively, not with the kind of attentiveness that could feel like surveillance, but in the easy, natural way of a man following a preference. He would stop at the laundry and drink a cup of the coffee she kept on the small stove and talk to her for 20 minutes while she worked. He brought her things occasionally. A book from the traveling peddler who came through on Thursdays, a cluster of wildflowers he'd passed on the road, a jar of honey from a fellow rancher who kept bees. And he brought these things without ceremony as facts, and she received them the same way. She was learning him. She was learning that his quietness was not coldness or absence. It was the quietness of a man who listened instead of filling space with noise. She was learning that he had opinions, firm ones, about cattle breeds and water rights and how a fence should be built, and that he held those opinions comfortably, without needing to defend them. She was learning that he was uncomfortable in crowds and at ease in the open, that he had a dry humor that appeared without warning and always surprised her, that he was unimpressed by status and respectful of work, that he had a particular and private tenderness for animals that he would probably have denied if she had pointed it out. She was also, slowly and with the terrifying deliberateness of a person dismantling a fortress one stone at a time, telling him things. She told him about her mother, who had died of a fever when Caroline was 15. She told him about the farm in Kansas, about her father's remarriage to a woman who had made it clear that Caroline was a complication. She told him about meeting Garland Bishop at a church social at 19, about how charming he had been in the early days, about the way the charm had slowly revealed itself to be a performance rather than a character. Seth listened to all of it without interrupting, without offering the kind of empty reassurances that people offer when they are waiting for their turn to speak. He listened the way he did everything, with his full, patient attention. One afternoon, sitting on the bench outside the laundry with the September heat finally beginning to moderate, she told him about the relief she had felt when Garland died, and waited to see what he would do with that. He was quiet for a moment. "That makes sense," he said. "It makes me sound like a terrible person," she said. "No," he said. "It makes you sound like a person who suffered for a long time and got free. Those aren't the same thing." She looked at him. "You're very certain about things," she said. "Only the things I'm certain about," he said. She reached over without quite planning to and put her hand on his arm. It was a brief, light touch, just her fingers on the fabric of his sleeve for a moment, and she felt him go very still. Not flinching still, attending still. The way an animal pauses when something significant has happened. She pulled her hand back. "Thank you," she said. "For listening." "Always," he said, and the simplicity of that word hit her somewhere deep and undefended. In October, he asked her to come out to the ranch. Not for any dramatic purpose. He was not that kind of man. He asked because he had 2 horses that were being difficult about shoeing, and he thought she might like to see them, as she had mentioned once in passing that she had grown up around horses. She rode out with him on a Sunday morning, on a quiet gray mare named Bessie who belonged to Saris at the livery, and the 4 miles of Texas plain spread out around them in the brilliant, clear October light were so beautiful that she stopped talking for long stretches and just looked. The house was small but well-made solid stone foundation, good timber walls, a porch along the front that caught the afternoon sun. There was a kitchen garden that had gone to dry seed at the end of the season, a barn, a corral, a windmill creaking in the breeze over a good well. It was the house of a careful, competent man who had made something out of nothing, and it was, in its plain and practical way, deeply appealing. He showed her the horses, 2 young geldings, Bay and Chestnut, that were indeed annoyed about shoeing, and proved it by dancing sideways and blowing hard when Seth approached. She watched him handle them, watched the patience and the steadiness, the way he gave them time to settle and did not force anything, and she thought, he is the same with horses as he is with people. He understands that trust is not a demand, it's an offer. She went into the corral and spoke softly to the chestnut, holding the back of her hand out and letting him sniff it, and when he had established to his own satisfaction that she was not a threat, she ran her hand along his neck and he stood for her easily. Seth was watching her from outside the corral, with an expression she had learned to identify as him being moved by something, and not quite showing it. She said, "They just need someone to not be in a hurry." "I know," he said. After the horses, he made coffee and they sat on the porch in the October sun, and it was the most peaceful morning she had had in years, and she was aware of it the way you are aware of warmth after cold with your whole body. "I like your house," she said. "Thank you," he said. "I built it thinking about what I'd want it to be like, not what I thought it should look like." He paused. "I put the east window large because I like the morning light." "It's a good house," she said. "It's a house that someone actually thought about." He looked at her sideways. "I've thought about it differently lately," he said carefully. She looked at him. He met her eyes. "I've been thinking about what else it needs," he said. "What else it might hold." The directness of it took her breath away in the most unexpected way. Not the directness of presumption, but the directness of honesty, a man simply saying what was true for him, making it a fact rather than a performance. "Seth," she said. "I'm not rushing you," he said. "I'm just telling you the truth about where I stand." "I know," she said. "I appreciate that." She looked out at the plain, at the dry golden grass in the far distance and the enormous sky. "I'm frightened," she said. "I know," he said. "I trusted the wrong person before," she said. "I was so completely certain of my own judgment and I was completely wrong, and the cost of being wrong was very high." "Yes," he said. "And now I think my judgment is telling me something," she said, "about you, and I don't know whether to trust my judgment." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said very carefully, "I can't prove to you that I'm a different thing than what you knew before. I can only keep being what I am, for as long as you need, and let you decide." She turned to look at him fully then, this quiet, sun-darkened, patient man on his porch in the October light, and she felt the last large piece of the wall she had been maintaining begin to move. "That is exactly the right answer," she said softly. He nodded. "I know," he said, and the tiniest curve of his mouth told her he was not being arrogant, just certain, and the certainty was gentle and absolute and nothing like the certainty of a man who needed to be right. It was the certainty of a man who knew himself. She stayed until the afternoon was almost gone, and he rode back with her to Dusthaven, and at the bottom of her staircase he took her hand, her whole hand, carefully, the way you hold something you do not intend to let fall, and he said, "Come back next Sunday." "Yes," she said. She went every Sunday in October and into November, and the shape of her life in Dusthaven shifted around a new center of gravity. She worked the laundry Monday through Saturday. She saw Seth twice in town each week. She went to the ranch every Sunday. Each time, the Sunday felt more natural and more like the beginning of something that her careful, practical heart was beginning to call by its real name. She was in love with him. She had admitted it to herself now, fully, without the protective distance of almost and something like. She was in love with Seth Reed in the plain and total way that she had never been in love with Garland Bishop, not even in the very beginning when she had thought she was. What she had felt for Garland was a younger woman's belief in the performance of love. What she felt for Seth was the real thing, built out of 3 months of watching him be consistently, quietly himself, of learning his mind and his habits and his humor, of receiving his care with growing and reluctant certainty that it was not habit or reflex but intention and preference and something that had her name on it. It scared her deeply, and it was the most alive she had felt in years. On a Sunday in mid-November, they were sitting by the fire in his main room after a long afternoon that had included fixing a section of fence, learning that Caroline was better with a hammer than Seth had expected, and a dinner of beef stew that they had made together in his kitchen in a collaboration of directions and laughter that had felt astonishingly domestic. And he turned to her from the fire with something in his face that she had not seen before. "I need to tell you something," he said. She looked at him. All right. He was quiet for a moment, in the way he was quiet when he was ordering his thoughts into the shape he wanted. "I came to Texas when I was 22, he said. "I told you that. What I didn't tell you was why I left Missouri." She waited. "I left because I'd done something I wasn't proud of," he said. "Not a crime, nothing that would put me in front of a judge, but something that cost another person considerably, and I knew it and I didn't stop it in time." He looked at the fire. "I was young and I was focused on what I wanted, and there was a woman who was engaged to a man who was not kind to her, and I knew it, and I told myself it wasn't my business, and she married him anyway, and 2 years later she was dead." Caroline felt the air in the room change. "I didn't cause it," he said. "I want to be clear about that. He did it. But I could have done something earlier, and I told myself it wasn't my business to intervene, and that has stayed with me." "What happened to him?" she said quietly. "Prison," he said. "He's still there as far as I know." She looked at him for a long moment. "Is that why you watch out for people?" she said. "Women specifically?" He met her eyes. "Partly," he said. "At first, yes, it was penance maybe, watching, making sure I didn't look away from something obvious again." He paused. "But that's not what this is. With you, I need you to know that. This isn't penance or habit or conscience. This is—" He stopped, let out a breath. "I see you, Caroline. Not what you need or what happened to you or what I can fix. I see you, and I want you to stay." The fire crackled between them. She stood up from her chair and crossed the short distance to the sofa where he was sitting, and she sat down beside him and looked at him from very close range, and she saw everything she needed to see: the fear in him, the honesty, the patience, the hope that he was holding with considerable self-control. She put her hand against his face. He went completely still. She said, "I'm staying." He covered her hand with his, and in the firelight, with the November wind outside and the smell of wood smoke and the sound of the plane beyond the walls, he leaned forward and pressed his forehead against hers and closed his eyes, and they stayed like that for a long, still moment that felt like the end of one kind of life and the beginning of another. He kissed her eventually, carefully, the way he did everything, with full attention and nothing hurried, and she kissed him back with the feeling of a woman who has been holding her breath for a long time and has finally exhaled. He asked her to marry him in December on a morning when the first frost had come to Dusthaven and the world was white and still. He did not make a production of it. He came to find her at the laundry in the early morning, before the day's work had fully started, and he said, quietly and directly, with his hat in his hands and his gray eyes on her face, "I would like to marry you, Caroline. I would like you to have the ranch with me and make that house what it could be. If you want that too." She looked at him for a long time. The fear was still there. It would probably always be there, some part of it, some thin wire of learned caution that she suspected would take years to fully unlearn, and she was making her peace with that. Fear was not the same as reason. She knew the difference between the fear that a thing would hurt her and the fear that a thing would change her, and what she felt now was the second kind. "Yes," she said. He smiled, that slow, full smile again, the one that changed his whole face. They were married on a Thursday in January of 1884, in the small white church at the east end of Dusthaven's Main Street. The minister was a red-faced, pleasant man named Reverend Cole, who had married most of Dusthaven and was efficient about it. Mrs. Prout was there, and Cyrus from the livery, and the DeLacys from the hotel, and Jefferson Crow the blacksmith, who shook Seth's hand for a long time and said nothing, but meant everything. Martha Greer was also there, and Caroline met her eyes across the small church and smiled at her with complete sincerity, because Martha Greer's well-intentioned interference had, in its sideways way, been the catalyst that broke the dam, and Caroline could afford to be generous. She wore her dark blue dress and a new white collar she had made herself from a piece of good cotton. Seth wore his dark coat and a new shirt. He had gotten his hair cut. She almost mentioned it and decided to let it be. When Reverend Cole said the words that made them married, Seth took her hand the same way he had taken it that first time, carefully, with the intention of not letting it fall. And when the Reverend said he could kiss the bride, he did it with the same quiet fullness with which he did all things, and she heard Mrs. Prout make a small happy sound from the front pew. She became Caroline Reed on a January Thursday, and the name felt so right and so fitting that she wondered, as she had occasionally wondered about the best things in her life, whether the universe had been working toward this particular arrangement from some point long before she had known to look for it. The move to the ranch was accomplished over a weekend with Cyrus's wagon. She did not have much. The carpet bag had by now been supplemented by a trunk, a collection of books, a few kitchen items she had accumulated, and the blue wool shawl that Seth had left on the stair rail in the early morning dark, which she kept with a deliberateness that he had not commented on but which she knew he had noticed. She learned the ranch the way she had learned Seth, carefully and with interest, finding in it both the challenges she had expected and the pleasures she had not. The kitchen garden was hers, and she expanded it in spring, putting in tomatoes and peppers and beans and squash with the focused intensity of someone building something. The horses became familiar, the two difficult geldings turning responsive and steady under her consistent handling. She learned to drive the wagon. She helped with the cattle work, not because she had to, but because she wanted to understand what Seth's days were made of, and when she was competent at something she told him so without waiting to be told she was right. She and Seth worked well together. She had not known before that work could be companionable, that two people could occupy the same space and the same tasks and create something out of it that was better than either of them alone. She had thought marriage was a negotiation, a transaction, a series of positions staked out and defended. She was learning that it could be a collaboration, something that moved and shifted and grew. They talked in the evenings by the fire, really talked, in the way she had never talked with another person, about ideas and memories and observations and opinions, about the state of Texas ranching and the condition of the plains and the news from the newspapers that came in from Abilene weekly. Seth was better read than she had initially assumed and held stronger opinions about politics and land rights than he had shown her early on. And she liked arguing with him about these things because he argued back without needing to win, just wanting to think clearly. She discovered that he had a real fear of enclosed spaces, a legacy of some incident he mentioned briefly and then set aside, and she simply made sure that, when they were in situations that might press on that fear, she was aware and adjusting without making it a matter of attention or discussion. She suspected he noticed this and was grateful for it in the way that he was grateful for most things, quietly and with specificity. He discovered that she woke from bad dreams occasionally, the remnant frequency of nightmares that had been more common in the first years after Garland and were now rare but not gone. He did not make a production of this either. He was simply there when it happened, a hand on her shoulder, a steady presence in the dark, a voice saying her name matter-of-factly until she surfaced. His name in the dark, in his voice, saying her name. This became the sound she associated with safety, which she thought was perhaps the most significant shift of all. By spring, she had told him everything. All of it, the details of the marriage she had not been ready to share before, the specific ways that Garland had operated, the things he had said and not said, the systematic removal of her sense of her own worth, the long process of hollowing out. She told him over the course of many evenings in pieces, not because she felt obligated to, but because she found that the telling was a kind of unpacking, a setting down of things she had been carrying alone, and Seth received each piece with the same steady presence and added nothing that was not needed. One evening, after she had told him something particularly difficult, he said, "I'm angry." She looked at him. "At me?" "No," he said with the particular quietness that in him meant something felt deeply. "At him, and at every person who saw it and didn't name it, and at the version of the world that let that be what happened to you." She looked at his face, the jaw set, the eyes steady with a controlled anger that was nothing like Garland's cold rages, was in fact the opposite of them, was an anger on her behalf that no one had ever had before. "I'm all right now," she said. "I know," he said. "That doesn't stop it from being true." She reached across and took his hand. They sat like that for a while. She had been on the ranch through the winter and into the spring and summer of 1884. And by the time the summer heat was in full force, she had ceased thinking of it as the ranch and started thinking of it as home in the way that a word changes meaning when you fill it with actual content. She had also, by summer, started to feel the particular kind of tiredness and particular kind of morning-specific nausea that she recognized from the descriptions of women she had known. And when she told Seth in July, his reaction was everything she could have wanted and nothing she could have predicted. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Are you well? How are you feeling?" She had expected she did not know exactly what she had expected. Something more dramatic, perhaps, something that was more about him. "I'm well," she said, "tired, a little sick in the mornings." He nodded. He took her hand. "What do you need?" he said. She looked at him. "I need you to stop looking at me like I might break," she said. "I'm not fragile." "No," he agreed. "You're not." He paused. "You're quite the opposite, actually." They sat with that for a moment. "I'm glad," he said then quietly, "very glad, but only if you are." "I'm terrified," she said honestly. "Yes," he said, "me too. But also," she searched for the word, "also something else." "Yes," he said, "me too." She laughed a little, and he smiled, and they sat together on the porch in the July heat with the planes rolling out in every direction, and the horses in the corral and the smell of the kitchen garden. And it was so far from where she had been 4 years ago that it felt like a different world, which she supposed was exactly what it was. In March of 1885, their son was born. The birth was difficult, long, exhausting, managed by the capable and unflappable midwife from Dusthaven named Mrs. Holt, who had been bringing babies into the world in this part of Texas for 20 years and was not rattled by anything. Seth spent the labor doing exactly what Caroline needed, which was staying close and not pretending that everything was fine when it was not, but also not letting fear become the dominant note in the room. When it was done, when Mrs. Holt placed the baby in Caroline's arms and said, "Fine boy," Caroline looked at the face of her son and felt something so enormous and so simple that she had no word for it. Seth was beside her. He looked at the baby with an expression she had never seen on him before, not quite any expression she had seen on anyone before, something exposed and full and humbled. He reached out one finger and the baby, eyes shut, curled a tiny fist around it. Seth made a sound very quiet, almost inaudible. "He's got your grip," Caroline said. Seth laughed, a rough, undone sound, and she saw the brightness in his eyes that he was not trying to conceal. They named him James after Seth's father and Caroline's grandfather, finding the name in both their histories without effort. James Reed was a loud, healthy, demanding baby who became a strong, curious, sun-browned toddler who followed his father everywhere and asked questions with the relentless determination of someone who needed to understand the entire world before the day was out. Seth answered every question with patience and completeness, and watching him with their son, Caroline sometimes had to stop what she was doing because the feeling in her chest was so full it needed a moment to accommodate itself. She had not known that a man could be this way. She had not had sufficient evidence in her prior experience to construct this model of fatherhood. She was grateful, in a new and specific way, for being wrong. Life on the ranch settled into a rhythm that was not without difficulty, but was full of a texture and substance she had not had before. The cattle operation was slowly growing. Seth had added a second well and was running more head, and they had hired a young Mexican hand named Marco Reyes who was good with horses and better with cattle, and who became, over time, a kind of fixture of the place that felt like belonging. Caroline's kitchen garden had by 1886 become a serious productive operation that supplied not only their own table but a portion of the Dusthaven general store, and the income from it was hers, managed by her, and the autonomy of that was something she appreciated in the quiet, thorough way she had learned to appreciate things. She went into town once a week. She maintained a friendship with Mrs. Prout, who had closed the laundry finally at the age of 62, and was living in cheerful retirement in the small house behind the church. She had a cautious and growing friendship with Nora DeLacy, and with a young woman who had arrived in Dusthaven in the spring of 1886 on a stagecoach with a carpet bag, and a face full of watchful, controlled wariness that Caroline recognized immediately. The young woman's name was Ruth, and she was 23, and she sat on the boardwalk outside the general store looking at the street of this unknown town with the expression of someone who has used up most of their available courage just getting here. Caroline sat down beside her. "You need work or just a room?" she said. Ruth looked at her. "Both," she said. "Mrs. Prout's is closed," Caroline said, "but the DeLacys could use help in the dining room and they have a room above the kitchen. Come with me." Ruth came. It took about 6 weeks before Caroline understood that Ruth's situation was not unlike her own had been at the broad level if not the specifics. She did not press. She simply made sure that Ruth knew she was welcome at the ranch on Sundays, and that she was, in this part of Texas, among people who would not require her to explain herself in order to deserve kindness. Seth, when she told him this, said only, "Good." She looked at him across the breakfast table. "You knew I'd do that," she said, "before I did." "Yes," he said. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because you didn't need me to," he said. "You just needed to see it." She looked at him for a moment. "I love you," she said, and the words came out with the ease of a thing said many times and meaning more each time, not less. He looked at her over his coffee cup. "I know," he said, with just enough of that dry quietness to make her laugh, and she did laugh, and he smiled. James was 2 years old by the autumn of 1887, and terrorizing the chickens they had added to the property and asking Seth approximately 6,000 questions a day about cattle, horses, stars, clouds, bugs, and the nature of holes in general. Seth answered all of them. Caroline watched and took note. She was also, by autumn, experiencing again the particular morning tiredness and morning nausea that she recognized. She told Seth in October. He put down his coffee cup and looked at her with the same focused attention he had given her the first time. "How are you feeling?" he said, "Tired," she said, "and a little sick in the mornings." "Same as before." "Roughly," she said. He nodded. "James will be pleased," he said. "He has opinions about siblings." "He is 2 years old," she said. "He has extensive opinions about most things," Seth said. "This seems like the kind of development he would have a perspective on." She laughed. Their daughter arrived in the spring of 1888, and they named her Clara after Caroline's mother, and she was from the first week a different creature from her brother, entirely quiet where James had been loud, watchful where he had been immediately active. She looked at the world with a measured and serious expression that Seth said looked exactly like Caroline's face during their first conversation, which Caroline considered a significant observation. James, who was 3 by then, regarded his sister with the mixture of suspicion and fascination that all small children bring to the reality of siblings. Within a month he was sitting next to her when she slept and explaining the world to her in the comprehensive and inaccurate way of a 3-year-old naturalist. The ranch continued to grow. By 1889 they had added a third hand, had expanded the corral and the barn, and Seth had begun talking about adding a room to the house. They argued about what kind of room it should be. Seth wanted it to be a study, and Caroline wanted it to be a bedroom for when the children got older and needed more space. And they compromised in the way they had learned to compromise, which was to talk it through until they arrived at something better than either original idea. In this case, a room with a large window that could serve as both. The addition was built over the course of the spring and summer of 1889. With Seth and Marco doing most of the work and Jefferson Crow coming out on weekends to help with the heavier framing, and Caroline bringing out lunch every day and eventually, when the work was far enough along, helping with the interior finishing herself. She was better at the fine joinery work than Seth, who was competent but less precise, and he acknowledged this without difficulty, and she did the windowsills and the door frames while he did the exterior. It was one of her happiest stretches of time, that summer working with her hands on something that would last, with her family around her, the children playing in the yard under Marco's occasional supervision, the plane blazing gold and blue in the July heat, the house growing as their life in it grew. She was standing on the newly completed porch one evening in August, looking out at the last of the sunset painting the sky over the Texas plain in shades of orange and coral and deep red, when Seth came and stood beside her. They were quiet together for a while, watching the colors change. "Caroline," he said, "are you happy?" She turned to look at him. He was watching the sunset, his profile in the fading light, the lines of his face familiar to her in every way, the weathered skin, the straight nose, the set of his jaw, the gray eyes that were on the horizon now and were always, she had come to understand, more expressive than he probably intended. "Yes," she said. "Genuinely, completely happy. Are you?" He turned to look at her then, and the expression on his face was the same one she had seen that first morning he had smiled at her fully on the hotel porch, open, specific, full-faced, a man who does not show that expression to many people and meant it every time he did. "Yes," he said. "I never thought I'd be like this. I thought happy was something that happened to other people in the way that some kinds of weather happen in other places. And now," she said. "And now I apparently have my own weather," he said, which was such an unexpected and poetic thing for Seth Reed to say that she burst out laughing, and he looked slightly startled and then laughed himself, that low, genuine sound, and she leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they watched the sunset finish itself, and the stars come out one by one over the Texas plain. James came running from around the side of the house at that moment, demanding to know if they could see the big star yet, the one that came out first because he needed to make a wish. Seth, without releasing Caroline's shoulder, said yes. There it was, that one, and James stood between them and scrunched up his face with the total physical commitment of a 4-year-old making a wish, and then opened his eyes and said, "Done." "What did you wish for?" Caroline asked. "You're not supposed to say," James said with 4-year-old authority, or it won't come true." "That's quite right," Seth said seriously. James ran back around the side of the house, apparently satisfied. She looked up at Seth. "What do you think he wished for?" she said. "A horse," Seth said. "He wishes for a horse every time." "He's 4, Caroline said. "He'll be 5, Seth said. "We could revisit the horse question at 5. "We could," she agreed. They went inside and put the children to bed, and the house was warm and full of the accumulated evidence of their life together, books on the shelves, Clara's baby quilt folded on the settle, James's collection of interesting rocks arranged on the window ledge, the blue wool shawl hanging on a peg by the door. And Seth came up behind her while she was banking the fire and put his arms around her and pressed his mouth against the back of her head. And she stood there in the warmth with her arms over his and felt, again, that enormous simple thing she still had no full word for. She had thought his kindness was habit. She had believed, for months, with the whole of her practical and self-protective heart, that she was one of many a stranded woman among other stranded women, a temporary concern of a generally benevolent man. And then she had found out that he had gotten up before dawn to bring a shawl to her specific window, that he had paid her specific debt, that he had watched Dale Rucker leave not because it was generally the right thing to do, but because it was specifically her he would not allow to be treated that way, that he had told no one any of it, had expected nothing in return for any of it, had simply, and this was the thing that had broken her open, the thing that she still marveled at, been paying attention to her as a specific person in the world, worthy of specific and deliberate care, not as a category or a cause or a conscience-easing project. She had been so sure it was habit. She had been so thoroughly, so safely, so self-protectively wrong. And the wrongness had been, in the end, the most important thing that had ever happened to her. She turned around in his arms and looked up at him. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited, those gray eyes on her face. "When Martha Greer told me you were kind to everyone," she said, "I believed her, and it broke something open in me. And what broke open was I realized I'd been in love with you for a while and had been calling it something else. And then you said what you said from under the staircase, and I understood the difference." She paused. "I just wanted you to know that what saved me wasn't just that you were kind. It was that you were specifically kind to me. That is the whole thing. That is what changed everything." He looked at her for a long moment. "Caroline," he said, "I have been specifically looking at you since the first morning in that livery stable. You were sitting in my coat with grit in your eyelashes and your back completely straight, like a woman who would not allow the circumstances to dictate her posture. I thought, that is someone remarkable." He paused. "I never had any interest in being general about it." She looked at him. "Your coat still smelled like horses," she said. "Most of my things do," he agreed. She kissed him, and he held her with the same care he had held everything of her, steady and intentional and nothing hurried. The winter of 1889 came in with cold, clear skies and frost on the windows, and the house was warm with firelight and the noise of children and the smell of bread baking. And Seth came in one evening from the barn with his breath clouding in the cold and his cheeks reddened, and he said, "Marco's got the cattle settled. Storm's going to miss us." "Good," Caroline said, stirring the pot on the stove. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen watching her for a moment. "Caroline, James told me he knows what he wants for his birthday." "His birthday is in March," she said. "I'm aware," Seth said. "And what does he want?" "A horse," Seth said. He presented an argument. It was surprisingly well-structured for a 4-year-old. She turned to look at him. "He'll be 5 in March," she said. "Yes," Seth said. "We could revisit the horse question at 5, she said, with an exact echo of his tone from August. He smiled slowly. "I thought you'd say that," he said. She served supper and they ate together. The 4 of them, James talking steadily about horses and stars and the structural engineering of ant hills, Clara watching him with her serious dark eyes and occasionally, with great deliberateness, handing him a piece of bread. And the fire was warm and the storm missed them, and the night came down clear and cold and full of stars. And Caroline Bishop Reed, who had arrived at Dusthaven with $43 and a dark past, and no plan beyond getting somewhere that the crushing could stop, sat at the table of her own house in the firelight with her husband and her children, and understood, completely and without reservation, that she had not just survived. She had arrived. James got his horse in the spring, a small, gentle, mouse-gray pony that Seth had found through a rancher up near Abilene and transported down over 2 days. James named him Comet, which was not accurate as the pony moved at approximately the speed of deliberate consideration, but James was committed to the name and they respected it. The pony became, along with everything else, a fixture of their life, one of the unremarkable, beloved constants that made up the fabric of their days on the Reed Ranch in Dusthaven, Texas, in the years when the frontier was still itself, still vast and unresolved and full of the particular combination of hardship and freedom that made people who survived it into who they were. Seth taught James to ride with the same patience he brought to everything. Caroline watched from the fence rail with Clara on her hip, and Clara pointed at the pony with a businesslike expression that suggested she too had opinions about this situation, which did not surprise Caroline in the least. By the end of summer 1890, Clara was walking and using about 40 words, half of which were proper nouns meaning things she intended to have. James was 6 and riding Comet with confidence and telling everyone in Dusthaven everything he knew about horses, which was quite a lot. Caroline was 31. Seth was 37. The ranch was solid and growing. They had 2 good hands, a good well, a good house, a productive garden, and a life that was built on something real. She was standing in the kitchen garden one morning in September, staking the last of the tomatoes before the season turned, when she heard Seth on the porch and looked up. He was standing at the porch rail with a cup of coffee, watching the plain, and the early light was on his face, and she thought for perhaps the 100th time what a good face it was, not beautiful in any arranged way, but true. A face that matched what was behind it. He saw her looking and raised his coffee cup in her direction. She raised her hand back. He came down off the porch and walked across the yard to where she was, bringing the coffee, and stood beside her in the kitchen garden while she finished with the steaks, and he was quiet in the comfortable way he was quiet, not the silence of having nothing to say but the silence of someone who is fully present without needing noise to prove it. "I was thinking," he said. "About what?" "About the south pasture," he said. "If we put in a second windmill, we could run more cattle in the dry months." "How much would the windmill cost?" she said. "About $80 for parts," he said. "Marco and I can do the work." "And the return?" He gave the number in terms of additional head per season, and she did the arithmetic in her head as she had learned to do and said, "That makes sense. Do it in spring before the dry sets in." He nodded. He drank his coffee. "Also," he said and stopped. She looked at him. "Also," he was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was being careful with words. "Are you happy here?" he said. "Still, I want to ask it now and then and have an honest answer." She pulled the last stake into the ground and straightened and looked at him fully. She thought about $43 sewn into a hem. She thought about a dust storm the color of a bruise. She thought about a hand at her elbow, steady and unhurried, and a voice saying, "You're going to want to get inside, come on." She thought about a coat that smelled like horses. She thought about a shawl left on a stair rail before dawn. She thought about a man saying, "I don't do this for everyone. I don't do any of this for everyone." She thought about everything she had thought was habit and had turned out to be something else entirely, something deliberate and specific and steady and built to last, the way good things are built. "Yes," she said, and she meant it with her whole self, with the parts of herself that had survived and the parts that had healed and the parts that were still healing and the parts that had been made new by this place and this man and this life. Genuinely, completely, and without reservation, she said. "Yes." He looked at her with those gray eyes, steady and specific and full of everything he did not say in large ways. "Good," he said. He took her hand. They walked back to the house together through the kitchen garden in the September morning, past the tomato stakes and the dried bean plants, and the herbs she had put in along the south wall, while somewhere in the house Clara was waking up and announcing it. And from the barn came the sound of James talking to Comet with the informative authority of a boy who has a horse and is not going to stop explaining things to it. And the Texas plain stretched out in every direction, enormous and clear. And the day was beginning in the way that good days begin, without drama, without crisis, without the need for anything to be different from exactly what it was. Caroline Reed stood in her garden in the morning light and felt, at the core of herself, a kind of peace that she understood was not the absence of difficulty or the guarantee of ease, but something sturdier and more honest than either the peace of a woman who had walked through darkness and arrived somewhere true, who was known and loved by someone who had chosen her specifically and kept choosing her, who had made something real out of nothing but courage and a willingness to be wrong. She had thought his kindness was habit. She had been gloriously, entirely wrong. And she would be grateful for that wrongness every morning of her life, including this one, and all the ordinary magnificent mornings that were still to come.